The disappearance of the Sodder children. It was Christmas Eve, 1945, in the small town of Fayetteville, West Virginia. The Sodder family, a hard-working, tight-knit Italian-American family, lived in a modest home on a hill. George and Jenny Sodder had 10 children, but that night, only 9 of them were at home. The youngest, 2-year-old Sylvia, was asleep in her crib, while the other children, ranging from 5 to 23 years old, had gathered for a festive evening with their parents. Little did they know, this would be the last Christmas they would ever celebrate as a family. The fire began shortly after midnight. George and Jenny were asleep when they were awoken by the smell of smoke. Panic struck as they scrambled to get out of the house. George rushed to the children's rooms, trying to rouse them, while Jenny called the fire department. The blaze seemed to spread impossibly fast, engulfing the home in mere minutes. Miraculously, George and Jenny managed to escape, along with Sylvia. But tragically, 5 of their children, Martha, Maurice, Louis, Jenny, and Betty, were trapped inside. Or so they thought. The fire was devastating. By the time the fire department arrived, the house had already collapsed, reducing the home to nothing but smoldering ruins. After the smoke cleared, there was no sign of the 5 missing children. Investigators declared the fire an accident, stating that the children had perished in the flames. Their remains were never found, and the cause of the fire was attributed to faulty wiring. The Sodders, though devastated, were left with little to hold on to, no remains, no clear answers. But George, in particular, couldn't accept that his children were gone. Something didn't add up. The fire had started on the roof, but there were no signs of the children's bodies in the wreckage, something that was unusual for a house fire of that magnitude. In fact, the fire had burned so intensely that the metal parts of the house had melted, yet there were no traces of their children's remains. A few days later, George began his own investigation. The local authorities had closed the case too quickly for his liking, and when he and Jenny started to ask questions, things got even stranger. There were several key details that made George question the official story. First, the ladder that was always kept at the back of the house was missing. When George tried to use it to escape the fire, it was nowhere to be found. A neighbor had mentioned seeing a strange car parked near the house earlier that evening, but no one had investigated further. As George dug deeper, he discovered that the fire had been more suspicious than he had initially thought. There were no traces of the children's bodies in the wreckage, and despite the fire's intensity, the house's foundation had been left relatively untouched. This didn't align with the standard behavior of house fires, which typically destroy everything in their path. To George, it seemed as though someone had intentionally set the fire, and his children might have been taken before the flames consumed the house. Then, a strange thing happened. Weeks later, the Sodders began receiving mysterious phone calls, strange, cryptic messages from someone claiming to know what had happened to their children. One night, a call came in from a man with a deep voice, whispering, "Your children are still alive." The call ended before George could respond. In January 1946, just weeks after the fire, George and Jenny received a bizarre letter. It was postmarked from Central City, Kentucky, over 200 miles away. The letter contained a photograph of a young man, seemingly in his 20s, who resembled their missing son, Louis. The photo was of a young man with strikingly similar features to Louis, and it included a note that said, "This is your son. He is alive and well." This was the beginning of the Sodders' search for the truth. They began traveling across the country, following up on tips and leads. They met with witnesses who claimed to have seen the missing children alive and well, sometimes in the company of strangers, sometimes in other towns. But no one could give a clear answer about what had happened to the children, and no one could identify who had taken them. Years went by, and the search turned into an obsession for George and Jenny. They received more letters and strange phone calls, some with threatening tones, others with cryptic messages. But despite all their efforts, the missing children were never found. The trail of clues grew colder with each passing year. In the meantime, the Sodders began to notice other strange occurrences, such as their children being spotted in towns far from home, always just out of reach. By the time George and Jenny passed away, the mystery of the Sodder children's disappearance remained unsolved. But even after their deaths, their children's story never faded. The family's surviving children, who grew up without their siblings, continued to search for the truth about their missing brothers and sisters. They even commissioned private investigators and forensic experts to try to uncover new evidence, but it was always the same, dead ends. To this day, many believe the children were kidnapped and the fire was set deliberately to cover up the crime. Some suspect that the local mafia, who had a presence in Fayetteville, may have been involved in the disappearance. Others think that the missing children may have been taken by a mysterious stranger who had been watching the Sodder family for some time. But the most chilling part of the story is that the mystery remains unsolved, and the fate of the 5 missing Sodder children continues to haunt the town of Fayetteville. Was the fire an accident? Was it arson? And, most disturbingly of all, were the children ever really lost, or were they taken and hidden away in plain sight? No one knows for sure. But the Sodder family's search for their children, a search that spanned decades, has left an indelible mark on those who still wonder what happened to the children who vanished on that cold Christmas night. The disappearance of the Sodder children remains one of the most mysterious and chilling cases in American history. Despite years of investigation and countless theories, the truth has never been uncovered, leaving an enduring sense of dread and uncertainty over the fate of those 5 young lives.